When my father first told me that teaching was not a real career, I remember the way he leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee as if he had just solved the great puzzle of life. His words weren't meant as advice. They were a dismissal, a reduction of everything I loved into something as small as babysitting. He smirked when he said it, the same smirk he used when I came home with awards from school or when I turned down the accounting job he wanted me to take. To him, my passion for shaping young minds was nothing but wasted energy, a placeholder until I would grow up and pick a real profession. I carried that sting for years, even when I tried to brush it off, even when I smiled and told myself he didn't understand. What I didn't know back then was that one day, the very grant he depended on, the one he guarded like a crown jewel, would fall under my control. And the moment that happened, all his dismissive words came crashing back to him in ways he never could have anticipated. I grew up in a household where appearances mattered more than feelings, where my father carried himself as the pillar of intellect and authority, and where my mother mostly echoed whatever he said to avoid his sharp tongue. He wasn't cruel in the way people imagine cruelty. He didn't raise his hand or shout unnecessarily, but his dismissiveness cut deeper than yelling ever could. I was the middle child, the one who learned to slip through conversations unnoticed, but also the one who dreamed big enough to push against his rigid expectations. When I told him I wanted to be a teacher, it was over dinner, a simple moment that could have been encouraging. Instead, he put down his fork, stared at me and said, "You mean a babysitter with a chalkboard?" My brothers laughed, because laughing was safer than disagreeing with him, and I just sat there, cheeks burning, feeling the sting of being trivialized. From that night on, every step I took toward my degree carried the weight of his scorn. He flaunted his connections in academia, spoke about research grants, conferences, the serious work of scholars. He said I lacked ambition, that I settled for something anyone could do. He never once stepped into my classroom, never asked about my students, never acknowledged the pride I felt when I saw a child grasp a concept for the first time. Yet behind all his disdain was irony so sharp it bordered on poetic, because the career he considered beneath him, the one he mocked relentlessly, would become the lever that tipped the balance of control between us. For years I buried myself in my work, pouring everything into my students, gaining respect from colleagues, slowly building a reputation he didn't even bother to notice. He thought my world was small, but what he failed to understand was that education opens doors far beyond the classroom walls. And while he sat in his office clinging to his title, I was gathering the tools to hold power in a place he thought was his alone. The first real fracture between us widened when he applied for a national research grant that he'd been chasing for years, the kind of funding that gave prestige, travel allowances, and recognition across universities. He strutted around the house like he had already won, bragging about his proposal to anyone who would listen, rehearsing speeches in front of my mother as though she were a conference audience. I kept quiet, but I knew something he didn't. Part of that grant required a partnership with the education department, specifically with school-based programs that could implement his theories into practice. At the time, I had already moved into a leadership role where I supervised multiple schools, evaluating programs and approving collaborations. My father had no idea how deep my influence ran. He thought I was just wrangling kids and calming parents, nothing more. But the reality was, my signature could make or break any external project that came through our district. The day his proposal landed on my desk, my heart stopped. His name, bold at the top, with his institution underneath. It felt like fate had written this moment with deliberate precision. I sat there staring at it, remembering every time he dismissed me, every time he said I had chosen a life of mediocrity, every time he laughed at my so-called little job. And now here I was, the gatekeeper to the opportunity he considered his crowning achievement. For the first time in my life, the balance of power shifted. He didn't even know it, of course. He walked into our next family dinner puffed up, announcing how confident he was that the grant committee would approve him. He even joked about how maybe I could proofread his materials since teachers are good with spelling. I smiled. I nodded. I let him keep talking, all while knowing the file was sitting on my desk with a decision pending. It wasn't about revenge right away. It was about realization, about the clarity that I wasn't small, I wasn't a babysitter, and my work carried weight he couldn't even begin to measure. But as the days went on and I reviewed his application, a darker thought crept in. Maybe it was time he learned that the daughter he belittled could hold his future in her hands with nothing more than a pen stroke. I took the application home one evening, sat at my dining table with the papers spread out before me, and read it line by line with the same meticulous care I gave to my students' essays. My father's words, his theories, his pompous phrasing leapt off the page. It was full of jargon but empty of heart. He proposed using funding to study pedagogical interventions in under-resourced schools. Yet not once did he mention the children themselves, only data sets, charts, numbers he could manipulate into impressive-looking graphs. It infuriated me because I had been inside those classrooms. I knew the names of the children he reduced to statistics. I knew which teachers worked late into the night to buy supplies out of their own pockets. And here was my father, who had never lifted a finger in a real classroom, planning to use their struggles as a stepping stone for his career advancement. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I scribbled notes in the margins, not just as an evaluator, but as his daughter, every correction feeling like an unspoken rebuttal to the years of silence I endured at our dinner table. He thought I was invisible, but my red pen had the power to dismantle him now. When I returned to work, I placed the file back on my desk, but instead of rushing to make a decision, I let it sit there. Days turned into weeks. My father grew more arrogant, telling anyone who would listen that he was a frontrunner, that his experience far outweighed the competition, that his proposal would be the backbone of the next decade of educational research. He didn't know that the district board was calling me, asking for clarification, leaning on my judgment to decide whether his proposal aligned with the values we wanted to uphold. I had the authority to recommend approval, denial, or revision. Each time I spoke to them, I felt the scales tip further in my favor. At family dinners, he would drop little barbs, subtle digs about my career. Well, at least you're doing something useful. Keeping kids entertained. Or, I suppose it's nice you don't have to think about real pressure. He didn't realize that the pressure was already in my hands, that every sarcastic smile only hardened my resolve. I began to imagine what it would look like if the rejection came back to him, not from a nameless committee, but indirectly from me. Would he storm into my office? Would he finally recognize that I wasn't the child he could dismiss anymore? I wasn't sure yet what I would do, but for the first time in my life, I felt the intoxicating weight of choice. The same man who taught me that I would never be enough had no idea that the decision that could end his ambitions sat with the daughter he'd spent a lifetime belittling. Day the committee meeting was scheduled. I wore my best navy suit, the one that made me look more like a policymaker than the babysitter my father had once mocked me to be. The conference room was filled with representatives from universities, school districts, and community programs, all of them scanning through the list of applicants. When his name came up, there was a hush in the room, a subtle shift of attention, because he was well known. His arrogance preceded him like a calling card. People expected me to speak, because my district had the largest say in determining which projects could actually be piloted on the ground. I cleared my throat, my hands steady even though my heart thudded against my ribs. I laid out my analysis with precision. How his proposal leaned too heavily on theory without actionable plans. How it lacked the involvement of teachers. How it presented underprivileged students as statistics rather than human beings. I didn't slander him. I didn't even mention our connection. I simply spoke the truth, and every sentence I delivered was like placing another stone on a scale that had always been tilted against me. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then someone asked if I recommended approval. I looked directly at the chairperson and said, "Not as it stands. It needs fundamental revision, otherwise it does not align with our district's mission." My words carried weight. They always do when spoken calmly, firmly, without apology. Within minutes, the board moved to table his application. He wouldn't be outright denied, but he would not receive the grant this cycle. For him, That was a professional humiliation worse than rejection, because it implied his work wasn't ready, wasn't good enough. Later that week, I got a phone call from him, his voice sharp, his composure cracked. He ranted about how the committee was blind, how politics had infected academia, how jealous colleagues had sabotaged him. I listened quietly, giving nothing away, until he finally said, "It doesn't make sense. Someone in your district must have pushed back." And in that moment, I let the silence hang just long enough for him to feel it. He knew. He wouldn't say it out loud, but he knew. For the first time in my life, the great man of intellect and stature realized the daughter he dismissed as a babysitter had the power to cut off the very oxygen feeding his career. And though I didn't gloat, though I didn't scream, I felt the quiet satisfaction of justice settling deep in my chest. He tried to recover his pride the only way he knew how, by attacking me in subtle jabs that he thought I wouldn't notice. At the next family gathering, he spoke loudly about how certain people in education lacked the vision to see innovative research, how small-minded administrators clung to the comfort of routine instead of pushing boundaries. He never said my name, but his eyes lingered on me long enough that everyone at the table understood who he meant. My mother shifted uncomfortably. My brothers pretended to focus on their plates, but I held his gaze without flinching. For once, I wasn't the one shrinking into silence. I had learned that real authority doesn't come from shouting. It comes from knowing you can act and letting that knowledge show in your composure. Behind the scenes, whispers began circulating. Colleagues who once admired him started asking questions. Why was his proposal stalled? Why had the committee grown cold? He tried to paint himself as a victim of politics, but the truth trickled out. People knew I had been on the panel. They also knew I had a reputation for fairness, that I wasn't easily swayed by grudges or personal ties. That contrast worked against him. His arrogance made him look bitter, while my calm professionalism made me look credible. He must have realized it too, because suddenly he started calling me more often, framing it as checking in, but really fishing for information. He asked how my schools were doing, if I was overwhelmed, if I needed guidance. I almost laughed. Guidance from the man whose entire career now teetered on the judgment of the daughter he spent years belittling. I answered politely, but never gave him more than surface-level replies. Each conversation was a reminder that he was trying to rebuild bridges he had burned, but this time, I was the one deciding which paths to open. And quietly, without boasting, I knew I held the upper hand in a way he could never undo. It wasn't long before the cracks in his career began to widen. The grant delay snowballed into other complications. Deadlines he couldn't meet without funding, conference invitations that dried up once word spread that his groundbreaking project had been tabled. His colleagues, who once flattered him, now whispered about his arrogance, about how maybe his best work was behind him. For a man who built his entire identity on being the smartest in the room, the shift was devastating. At home, he became restless, pacing through conversations, snapping at small inconveniences, and trying harder than ever to assert his authority in family settings. But something had shifted permanently. I no longer felt the sting of his words. When he called me a babysitter again in a half-joking tone, I didn't flinch. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Funny you say that, because lately I've been the one babysitting your career." The table fell silent. He stiffened, forced out a laugh, but his face betrayed him. The humiliation was there, raw and unmasked. My mother scolded me later for being disrespectful, but I felt no guilt. For years, I swallowed his dismissals without a word. Now, for the first time, I let him taste what it felt like to be reduced. And the best part? I hadn't even pushed as hard as I could. I had options: letters I could write, meetings I could sway, doors I could close. Yet I didn't need to use them all. The simple fact that I had the power was enough to change the balance forever. He knew it, I knew it, and no amount of bluster could erase that. By the time 6 months had passed, the dynamic between us was unrecognizable. My father, who once strutted through every room convinced that the world owed him reverence, had begun to shrink into someone defensive, almost desperate to reclaim the authority he used to wield without question. He still tried to keep up appearances, of course. At academic dinners, he would brag about his pending projects, but behind closed doors, he was scrambling. I knew because whispers always found their way to me. Colleagues who told me he'd reapplied for smaller grants and been rejected. Former allies who admitted they were tired of his arrogance and unwillingness to adapt. It was ironic. He had spent his life dismissing teaching as beneath him, yet now, the very teachers he disrespected were shaping the policies and approvals he so desperately needed. More than once, I received proposals tied loosely to his work, projects where his name appeared as a consultant or co-author, and each time my evaluation was requested, I read them carefully. Some I rejected for poor quality, others I passed on without recommendation, but never did I bend the rules. I treated him like I treated any applicant, and the truth was his work simply didn't hold up anymore. It lacked the innovation, the relevance, the humility to meet the standards we required. Watching him struggle was not the sweet, vengeful triumph I once thought it might be. It was quieter, more sobering. It made me realize that the real revenge wasn't in destroying him. It was in no longer needing his approval, in knowing that my life and career had grown into something he could neither diminish nor control. Still, there were moments that struck me with a kind of poetic justice. One afternoon, he called me under the guise of just catching up, but his voice betrayed him. He asked if I knew anyone on the panel of a new grant he was pursuing, if I had any advice for how to frame his application. I leaned back in my chair, holding the phone to my ear, and thought about the irony of that moment. The man who once told me my work was nothing but glorified babysitting was now seeking my guidance, hoping the daughter he had scorned could help him salvage his reputation. I didn't mock him. I didn't lash out. Instead, I told him calmly, "You might want to spend more time listening to the people you've ignored all these years. The teachers, the administrators, the ones in the classrooms. They're not just data points. They're the key to everything you're trying to do." He went quiet, then muttered something about being busy and hung up. But I knew he heard me. And in that silence, I felt the final piece click into place. I didn't need to ruin him. He was unraveling all on his own, and I was simply standing in the position he never imagined I would occupy, the one with the power to decide whether his voice still mattered. As the years passed, my father's decline became a study in irony. The man who once lectured me endlessly about ambition and real careers found himself cornered by the very system he had taken for granted. He had built his empire on arrogance, believing his intellect alone would shield him from accountability, but academia had shifted. Committees now valued collaboration, innovation, and measurable impact, none of which he was willing to embrace. He had spent decades dismissing teachers, mocking administrators, treating us as little more than background noise in his pursuit of prestige, and now those very people were the gatekeepers to his survival. I would attend conferences where his name was whispered, no longer in admiration but in pity, and every time I overheard, I remembered the countless nights I had cried myself to sleep after one of his cutting remarks. Yet, instead of gloating, I felt something far stronger: liberation. His opinion no longer mattered. I didn't crave his approval, didn't shrink under his shadow, didn't fear his voice. I was free. What made it even more striking was how our personal relationship mirrored his professional unraveling. Family dinners became quieter, less dominated by his booming certainty, because everyone could feel the change. My brothers, who once laughed at his jokes about me, now asked me about my work with genuine interest. My mother, timid and complicit for so long, began looking at me differently, almost with pride, though she rarely said it out loud. And my father, stripped of his pedestal, began to falter. He asked fewer questions, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to face the truth. The daughter he had ridiculed now held more credibility than he did. There was one evening I'll never forget. He came to my office unannounced, standing in the doorway like a ghost of the man he once was. He glanced around at the framed certificates, the photos of students, the awards I had earned, not for research, but for impact, for changing lives in tangible ways. He looked smaller in that moment, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes darting as though he couldn't quite accept what he saw. Finally, he said, "You've done well." Just 3 words, spoken without his usual sarcasm, and for the first time in my life, I believed he meant them. But it was too late. I didn't need his validation anymore. I thanked him politely, closed the file I had been working on, and returned to my tasks. Because that was the true victory. Not in destroying him, not in watching him crumble, but in knowing I had built a life so strong, so undeniable, that his scorn no longer held any power over me. My revenge wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and absolute. I had become everything he said I couldn't be, and I had done it on my own terms. The final shift came slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it was undeniable. My father, once the unshakable authority figure whose voice silenced rooms, had become someone who tread carefully around me, as though he finally understood that his words no longer carried weight. He still tried now and then to reclaim the role of lecturer, but the edge was gone. His barbs lacked teeth, his superiority rang hollow. When he spoke about academia, it was no longer with the certainty of a man who owned the stage, but with the bitterness of someone watching the world move on without him. And it had. His colleagues retired or adapted, his rivals published and gained recognition, but his name faded from relevance, a relic of an older era that no longer impressed the new generation. I remember one particular moment at a community event where we both had been invited to speak. I took the stage first, sharing stories about student progress, about programs we had launched that directly improved graduation rates and literacy levels. The audience leaned in, nodding, clapping, connecting with every word. When my father stepped up after me, he launched into a dense monologue about theory and frameworks, and I watched as people's eyes glazed over, their attention slipping. For the first time, I wasn't the one overlooked. He was. Afterward, a small group of teachers surrounded me, thanking me for my work, asking for advice, while he stood to the side, pretending not to notice that no one was waiting for him. It struck me then. This was the revenge I never planned but always needed. Life had turned the tables naturally. His power to belittle me had evaporated, replaced by my power to succeed without his permission. He never apologized. He wasn't built that way. But in his silences, in the way he avoided direct confrontation with me, I could feel the unspoken admission. He knew he had underestimated me. He knew he had been wrong. And while part of me had once longed to hear the words, I realized I no longer needed them. I had outgrown his approval, his disapproval, his entire framework of judgment. My career, my students, my reputation. Those were the markers of my worth, and none of them required him. That was the final liberation, the closing of a chapter that had begun the day he called me a babysitter. He thought he had defined me, but in the end, I had written my own definition, one that left his voice as little more than background noise in the story of my life. When he eventually retired, it wasn't with the fanfare he always imagined, but with a quiet announcement buried in a departmental newsletter. No banquet, no honorary lecture series, no packed auditorium of protégés cheering his name. He slipped out of academia like a shadow at dusk, and the world barely noticed. I didn't attend whatever small gathering his university arranged, though I was invited. Instead, I spent that evening at one of our district schools, watching a group of students present their science fair projects with the kind of pride and excitement he had never understood. As I moved from table to table, listening to children explain their experiments, I thought about the contrast. My father, retreating into obscurity, clinging to theories no one valued anymore, and me, standing in a room filled with light, surrounded by futures that were just beginning. The irony was almost too sharp to ignore. He had once said teaching was not a real career, and yet here I was shaping generations, influencing policy, directing grants, and leaving a legacy he could never touch. Over time, his calls became less frequent. When he did reach out, his tone was gentler, stripped of the arrogance that had once colored every word. He asked about my work, sometimes even listened, though I could tell it pained him to admit how far I had come. My brothers noticed too. They teased him once, saying it was funny how the babysitter had ended up outshining him. He scowled, but he didn't deny it. And that silence, more than any apology, told me everything I needed to know. I had not only proven him wrong, I had built something bigger, stronger, more enduring than his fleeting academic glory. My revenge was never about tearing him down. It was about standing so tall that his attempts to belittle me looked absurd, and I had done exactly that. In the later years, when his hair had turned completely gray, and his once commanding voice softened into something almost fragile, I realized the story had come full circle. My father, who had spent his life lecturing others and dismissing me, was now the one fading into the background. He rarely spoke about his career anymore, perhaps because he knew it no longer impressed anyone. At family gatherings, he listened more than he talked, and when he did speak, it was often about small things: the weather, the garden, old memories of childhood. He never directly admitted the shift, but I could see it in his eyes when he looked at me across the table. The reluctant acknowledgement that the daughter he had once reduced to a babysitter had outgrown not just his expectations, but his entire worldview. By then, my work had expanded beyond what I ever imagined when I first chose teaching. I wasn't just supervising schools, I was shaping policy, overseeing programs that reached across districts, and training new educators who carried forward the vision he could never grasp. Grants that had once been the lifeblood of his career now bore my signature and approval, my evaluations in their margins. Ironically, institutions that once idolized him now courted me, asking for my perspective, my endorsement. And yet I didn't carry bitterness. The fire that once drove me to prove him wrong had transformed into something steadier: confidence, rooted not in vengeance, but in the unshakable knowledge that I had built a life of meaning. Still, there were moments where the irony stung him in ways I couldn't soften. Once, I received an award for community impact, a recognition that made headlines in our local paper. My father clipped the article, I later learned, and tucked it into a drawer rather than displaying it. He couldn't bring himself to celebrate me publicly, but he also couldn't throw it away. That torn place between pride and regret, that was his burden, not mine. The greatest revenge, I realized, wasn't in watching him crumble or hearing him apologize. It was in living fully, in thriving so completely that his old insults lost all their weight. He had tried to write my story for me, but I had taken the pen back and crafted one far richer than he could have imagined. And as I stood in classrooms, in conference halls, in boardrooms filled with educators and students whose lives were touched by the work I poured myself into, I knew the truth with crystalline clarity. My father's voice no longer defined me. My own did, and it carried further than his ever had. In the end, the silence between us became the loudest testament of all. My father never uttered the words, "I was wrong," but he didn't need to. I saw it in the way he paused when others praised my work, in the way he avoided interrupting me when I spoke, in the way his once cutting remarks dwindled into nothing more than muttered comments that carried no sting. Age had humbled him, but life had already done what I once dreamed of. It had exposed his arrogance as hollow, while elevating everything he dismissed. By the time I reached my 40s, I was no longer just a teacher or even a district leader. I had become a voice in state-level education reform, sitting on panels that shaped the future of classrooms across the country. Legislators quoted my findings, universities asked me to deliver keynote speeches, and my inbox overflowed with invitations to collaborate. Every recognition, every success was a living refutation of his words. He had once told me teaching was nothing but babysitting, but here I was, steering the very ship of education that funded, shaped, and approved the work of scholars like him. And while his name slipped quietly into academic obscurity, mine was gaining ground. There was one evening, not long before his health began to fail, when we sat together on the porch in rare quiet. He watched the sunset, his hands trembling slightly as he sipped his tea, and after a long silence he said, "You've built something lasting." It wasn't an apology, but it was as close as he could come. For a moment, I considered pressing him, asking if he remembered all the years of ridicule, if he understood the weight of what he had done to me. But instead, I simply nodded. Because by then I had realized the most powerful revenge wasn't dragging him into confession. It was knowing that, in his own guarded way, he finally saw the truth. His voice no longer held authority over me. Mine had grown louder, stronger, impossible to ignore. And that, more than any cutting remark or delayed apology, was the victory I had been waiting for all along. When his health began to decline more seriously, the dynamic between us shifted once again, though not in the way some people might imagine. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no tearful apologies, no sudden rewriting of history. My father remained who he always was, proud, stubborn, reluctant to admit fault, but his edges softened in the quiet moments when age and illness stripped away his armor. I visited him in the hospital more out of duty to myself than to him, because I didn't want unfinished business to weigh on me later. He would lie in bed, thinner than I had ever seen him, tubes humming quietly at his side, and sometimes he would ask about my work. The questions were different now, not mocking, not dismissive, but curious in a way that almost felt like respect. He asked how my students were doing, how the new policies were unfolding, what changes I thought would shape the next generation of schools. It was jarring to hear him ask after years of belittlement, but I answered calmly, not to prove a point, but because I wanted him to see that my life had grown beyond his shadow. One afternoon, as the sun slanted through the blinds, he said something that stayed with me. "You kept going, even when I didn't believe in you. That's something." It wasn't a full admission, but for him it was monumental, and for me it was enough. I didn't need him to spell out his regrets, because by then, my life was proof enough of who I had become. I had power, respect, influence, but more importantly, I had peace. The revenge I once thought I wanted, the dramatic confrontation, the moment of humiliation, was nothing compared to this quiet certainty that I had built a legacy out of the very thing he dismissed, and he lived long enough to see it. When he finally passed, the eulogies focused on his achievements, his intellect, his publications, but I knew the deeper truth. His greatest unintended legacy was me, the daughter who rose from his scorn, who turned his dismissal into determination, who outlived his reputation not by tearing it down, but by building something far greater beside it. And as I stood there, listening to the speeches, I felt no bitterness, no lingering need for revenge, only clarity. He had tried to define me, but in the end, I had written the final chapter. After his passing, I expected to feel an emptiness, a grief tangled with anger. But what I actually felt was release. For so many years, my father's shadow had loomed over every decision, every success, every step forward, his voice echoing in my head with words that belittled, words that tried to cage me in. Now that weight was gone. I wasn't free because he was no longer alive. I had freed myself long before. But his absence closed the last unfinished page of a story that had defined my youth. In the weeks that followed, I was surprised by how many people reached out to me, not to talk about him, but about me. Former colleagues of his sent quiet notes, saying they admired what I had built in education, how they saw my work carrying on where his had failed to adapt. Former students of mine, now adults with careers and families, wrote to tell me how my teaching had shaped their lives. At his memorial, people whispered about his brilliance, but when they spoke to me, they didn't talk about his legacy. They asked about my programs, my initiatives, the future I was still building. It struck me then that my revenge was never really about him at all. It was about reclaiming my narrative, proving to myself that I could grow beyond the limits he tried to impose. And I wasn't just a teacher anymore. I was a leader, a mentor, a builder of futures. Every life I touched, every policy I shaped, every classroom that thrived because of my work, that was my triumph, my lasting mark. My father had once said teaching was not a real career, but in the end, it was his career that faded quietly into obscurity while mine continued to expand, ripple, and endure. That realization filled me with a calm sense of justice. the kind that doesn't need applause or dramatic endings. The girl he once dismissed had grown into a woman whose impact outlived his voice, whose influence reached farther than his grants ever could. And in that truth, I found the purest form of revenge. Not loud, not cruel, but undeniable. Years later, when I would look back on the arc of my life, I realized that my father's scorn had been both my greatest wound and, strangely, my greatest catalyst. Every time he told me teaching was nothing, I pushed harder to make it something. Every time he laughed at my choices, I doubled down to prove that those choices had value. And though I no longer needed his approval, the echoes of his dismissal had built in me a resilience no one could take away. By the time I was recognized on a national scale, asked to testify before a committee on educational reform, quoted in newspapers that once ignored voices like mine, I understood that I had crossed into a realm of influence he never imagined possible. I wasn't just shaping classrooms anymore, I was shaping futures at a structural level. And as I stood there, microphones flashing, journalists scribbling notes, I thought of the man who once sneered at me over dinner, calling me a glorified babysitter. The irony was sharp. His name was fading from the footnotes of academic journals, while mine was etched into the living, breathing fabric of schools, communities, children's lives. My revenge was never about destroying him. It was about transcending him, outlasting him, proving that the roots I planted in a field he scorned would grow into something stronger than his lofty towers of theory. When people asked me about my journey, I never spoke of him. I spoke of the children who taught me patience, of the teachers who showed me resilience, of the communities that embraced me when I stood my ground. But in the quiet of my own heart, I knew the truth. He had tried to cage me with his narrow definition of worth, and I had broken through. And that, more than any grant, more than any award, was the victory I would carry for the rest of my life. By the time I reached the height of my career, his memory had become more of a faint shadow than a looming presence. I was leading statewide initiatives, mentoring new generations of educators, and even consulting internationally on programs that would lift entire communities out of cycles of underachievement. My days were filled with meaningful conversations, real results, and the kind of fulfillment he had never understood because he only ever chased prestige. And yet, in quiet moments, I would still remember the sting of his words, the way he smirked as if my life's calling were nothing more than a phase. It no longer hurt. It only sharpened the contrast between the world he believed in and the one I had built. At one point, a university where he had once lectured invited me to give the keynote address at their annual education summit. I stood on the very stage where he had once commanded attention with his theories, and I spoke instead of children's names, stories of transformation, the humanity behind the statistics. The room erupted with applause that felt genuine, alive, so different from the polite acknowledgement he had been used to. That moment sealed something deep within me. I had not only stepped out of his shadow, I had claimed a light of my own. My father had called teaching babysitting. But babysitting doesn't change policies, it doesn't rebuild schools, it doesn't break generational cycles of poverty, and it doesn't inspire thousands to reimagine what education can be. My work had done all of that. His had faded into forgotten footnotes. And as I walked off that stage, I knew beyond doubt that the greatest revenge was never in confrontation. It was in legacy. His voice had tried to define me, but mine was the one that endured, carrying forward into futures he could neither dismiss nor control. When I entered my 50s, the full measure of what I had built finally became clear. My days were no longer consumed only by managing schools or approving grants. They were filled with mentoring young teachers, consulting with governments on education policy, and speaking at conferences where the very people who once idolized my father now came to me for guidance. I had become the authority he once claimed only he could be, but the difference was that my authority was rooted in service, not ego. There was a time I thought revenge would feel like standing over him, watching him beg for acknowledgement. But by then I understood the deeper truth. The real revenge was in living so fully, so undeniably that his attempts to belittle me had become laughable. His career was a fading echo, remembered by a handful of aging colleagues, while mine pulsed vibrantly through classrooms, communities, and generations of students who would never know his name but would feel the ripple effects of my work. There were moments when I would be invited into boardrooms filled with policymakers, and I would think back to being that young girl at the dinner table, cheeks burning as my father mocked me in front of my brothers. That girl had once swallowed her words, but now she was the one whose voice shaped laws and budgets, the one whose vision carried more weight than his entire academic career ever had. And yet, even with all that, I carried no bitterness, only clarity. His ridicule had built the steel in my spine, but it no longer defined me. What defined me were the students who came back years later to tell me they had gone to college because I believed in them, the teachers who said my mentorship gave them courage to stay in classrooms, the parents who thanked me for programs that gave their children opportunities he would have dismissed as insignificant. My father had tried to measure success in titles, in grants, in prestige. I measured mine in lives changed, in futures opened, in voices strengthened. And by every metric that mattered, I had won. He was gone, his legacy crumbling into obscurity, while mine grew louder, brighter, stronger with every passing year. That, I realized, was the most complete revenge of all. Not a battle I fought against him, but a life I built beyond him. Now, standing in the fullness of my own life, I see the story clearly for what it is. Not just a clash between a father and a daughter, but a lesson in how voices meant to silence us can become the very fuel that drives us. My father thought he was cutting me down when he called me a babysitter, when he told me I had no ambition, when he dismissed the work that I poured my soul into. But what he never realized was that every word, every smirk, every slight became a stone I used to build my foundation. His world was small, confined to prestige and recognition, but mine grew wide, rooted in lives changed and futures rewritten. I did not need his approval in the end. I had created a life that proved its own worth, a legacy that will outlast any grant, any lecture, any fleeting applause he once craved. And maybe that's the truest kind of revenge, not shouting him down, not dragging him into apology, but living so completely and authentically that his judgment lost its power. I carried his doubt and I turned it into strength. I carried his scorn and I turned it into impact. And now when I look back, I no longer feel anger. I feel gratitude for the fire it lit, even if it came wrapped in cruelty. Because in the end, I won by becoming someone he could never have imagined, someone who no longer needed his permission to exist fully. But tell me, what do you think? Was my quiet triumph enough? Or should I have confronted him directly and demanded the apology he never gave?